Dear friends, welcome to this webinar on the UN's mandate for Afghanistan under the Taliban. We are very happy to have a fantastic lineup of panelists. I will introduce them shortly. The event has been organized by the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. We are located in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame in the US. And we're organizing this event in partnership with PRIO, the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. I'm Laurie Nathan. I'm director of the Kroc Institute's mediation program. And our focus, as I've said, is on the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, which is a special political mission of the United Nations tasked with assisting the people of Afghanistan. That's its broad mandate. In March 2022, UNAMA received a renewed mandate from the UN Security Council to coordinate and facilitate humanitarian aid, to advance human rights, to promote responsible governance and the rule of law, and to facilitate dialogue between Afghan political actors and stakeholders, the region, and the wider international community. In this discussion, as consideration is given in the UN Security Council to the renewal of the mandate, we're interested in how UNAMA has managed to manage its mandate and implement its mandate under Taliban rule. We're interested in what UNAMA has achieved and what challenges and obstacles it's confronted. We will have an opportunity for audience questions and answers, which you're welcome to submit if you wish through the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm going to introduce very briefly our panelists. If you wish to have a look at their bios in more detail, you're welcome to do that. You'll find that information on the Kroc Institute website where we advertise this event. We've asked our panelists to talk for 7-8 minutes, covering the main themes of this event, and then we'll have this opportunity for a Q&A and an exchange between the panelists. The first speaker will be Arif Dostia, who is Senior Advisor on the new Kroc Institute program on Afghanistan. He was previously the Consul General of Afghanistan in Los Angeles. Our second panelist will be Ambassador Yusuf Ghafurzai, who is currently the Ambassador of Afghanistan to Norway. Our third panelist will be the Deputy Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations, Ambassador Trine Heimerbach. Our fourth panelist will be Michael Keating, who is currently Executive Director at the European Institute of Peace. And amongst other things, Michael was previously UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Afghanistan. Our fifth panelist will be Ms. Hosna Jalil, former Deputy Minister of Women's Affairs and Interior Affairs in Afghanistan. And then after the Q&A, we will have closing remarks from Professor Christian Berg Hapwijken, who is Research Professor and Director of the Middle East Center at PRIO, our partner for this event. With that, I hand over to Arif.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Professor Nathan, for the introduction. I'm pleased to be with such a rich panel of people here, and would like to thank my dear colleagues, Ambassador Ghafurzai and Mr. Hosna Jalil, for being with us. I also want to appreciate Ambassador Heimerbach and Mr. Keating. And we're just really pleased to be partnering with PRIO and Dr. Christian on this. On the question of UNAMA, I think that we need to be realistic, have a realistic view of the situation. It's likely that UNAMA's mandate will be renewed in mid-March, and I'm interested in hearing Ambassador Heimerbach from her on that. But I also think that there will not be substantial changes in the new mandate or in the renewed one. There are just so many differences in the Security Council on Afghanistan, but also deep divisions on other issues globally. So any change will require negotiation, and negotiation will take time, which we don't have right now. So I have 3 quick proposals for our colleagues in UNAMA. The first one is to prioritize areas of focus. The current mandate is very strong, which is what we wanted last year, but perhaps we learned that it's also too ambitious. As we say in Afghanistan, like a herbalist's shop in Afghanistan, where you can find pretty much medicine for every pain. The reality of the situation is that issues are being created by the regime. Before one is resolved, another one arises. And this may be exhausting our UN colleagues on the ground. So prioritizing certain areas might get us out of the responsive alone approach. And on this, I have the second proposal. While there are lots of emergencies, perhaps the heart of the issue is, in my opinion, more political than anything else. And if this is true, then political dialogues need to be prioritized. Of course, many questions arise when you say political dialogues, for instance, between who, the Taliban not being willing to participate, divisions among the opposition groups, etc., etc. But it just shows how much work we have to do. My last proposal is that we do not confine the political work of UNAMA within the geography of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a people first, then a geography. And millions of these people have scattered around the world in the past 40 plus years because of war and conflicts and other issues of emergencies and so forth. This is also not something new. In the past 20 years, in the Republic time, UNAMA continued to make trips to Doha and other places to meet with the Taliban. Historically, people in exile and outside of the country have been very active, and they have most of the time created change inside the country, as we have seen recently as well. And so it's important that we have a wide and an inclusive approach and engagement with all actors inside and outside of the country. And finally, I would like to acknowledge that UNAMA has been essentially the ears and eyes of the world on the ground. Certainly things need to improve to implement the mandate more effectively. But I also want to acknowledge the valuable field presence of UNAMA. Thank you, Laurie, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you for those framing questions and proposals, Arif. I'm going to call now on Ambassador Ghafurzai to make his remarks. Ambassador, you're welcome to address any aspect of our agenda today. I think we're particularly interested to hear from you on the question of facilitation of dialogue and to what extent this has been possible by UNAMA and what recommendations you would make in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, a very good morning and good afternoon to all friends and colleagues where you are. I want to first start by thanking the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies for holding this webinar on the UN's engagement in Afghanistan. I think it's a very timely but also very important discussion in light of the situation in Afghanistan 17 months after the Taliban's military takeover. And also the need for a new international approach to help restore some degree of stability, hopefully in the immediate future. Before going further, I do want to say a word about the UN's historic position of support for Afghanistan. I think there's sometimes a tendency to reflect on the UN's engagement during the post-2001 period alone. But I think it's also important not to forget that the UN has been involved in Afghanistan since the 1980s, during the era of the liberation movement against former Soviet occupation, and also during the 1990s, it operated under a special mission for Afghanistan known as UNSMA. At the time, the UN was then focused on mainly providing humanitarian assistance, but also on trying to reach some form of political agreement or understanding between the Taliban and the then government of the Islamic State of Afghanistan. So from a historical context, we see that the crisis in Afghanistan has continued for almost 3 decades now without a permanent solution being reached. Very briefly, what happened in August 2021, I think, is a result of various factors, internal, regional, and international. Internal, because there was a failure or missed opportunity to strengthen national unity in Afghanistan in previous years. Regional, because known actors in our neighborhood empowered the Taliban with support instead of influencing them to be serious about talks. and international because international forces withdrew before an agreement was reached between the people and the Taliban. But when speaking about the core of the crisis, whether it be past or present, I think we have to say that it has also been political. During the mid and latter part of the 1990s, we saw that the people of Afghanistan did look to the international community to broker a political agreement. In 2001, the Bonn Agreement took place, but it was not complete. And in more recent years, peace efforts failed due to several factors, but mainly because of the Taliban's lack of commitment to a settlement. But despite the failures of the past, I think the international community now needs to begin a serious political process with the UN in the lead. In the past year, the UN's activities have mainly covered dialogue and engagement with the Taliban, delivery of humanitarian assistance, and focus on the issue of human rights, mainly of women and girls. But 17 months on, we see that the situation has not only failed to improve, but it's getting worse. Therefore, starting with the UN first, the international community, I think, needs to adopt a new approach. And I emphasize new approach. And that approach should first deal with not just the symptoms of the crisis, but the source of it. And secondly, an approach that helps shape the environment that's needed for progress towards stability. So how can UNAMA's new mandate help change the direction? I will highlight 5 points. 1, on the UN's good offices and outreach for political dialogue. And obviously, last March, with Norway's very able stewardship as former penholder in Afghanistan, the Security Council did give UNAMA a role to facilitate dialogue between political actors and stakeholders in the region as well as the international community for a government that will be seen acceptable, inclusive, and also responsive to the people's needs. But so far, we have seen that the UN's activities in the political track have lagged far behind efforts in the humanitarian and human rights fields. And the UN's outreach with non-Taliban figures and regional international actors to start a serious political process hasn't been what it could have or should have been. And whatever political engagement that has taken place has mainly been with the Taliban, and also in some cases, a selected group of non-Taliban figures who stayed behind in Afghanistan. I think the UN's outreach needs to also include political forces who are now outside Afghanistan. In the past year, we've seen civil society and women and youth groups and political parties, new and old, mobilize. They've become politically active, trying to find solutions. The UN's engagement with these groups should be part of a larger process to develop and implement a political roadmap. And a roadmap that leads to an inclusive transitional government first, that revives the spirit of lost national unity, or revives the lost spirit of national unity, helps adopt a constitution, and leads to the eventual holding of elections for people to decide their future. At the same time, the UN should consider new measures to influence the Taliban to respect the rights of all Afghans and to accept a national agreement with other political groups. The alternative of continued imposed rule will only deepen the crisis and the threat of international terrorism. Secondly, on governance and democratic values. And I think this is an important point that has often been forgotten, that support for democratic values, including civil society empowerment, were an important part of UNAMA's activities for many years. Yet support for these values have not featured clearly in the UN's activities since the Taliban's takeover. Yes, we know that the situation today is different than that of 2 years ago. And yes, we have to be realistic and practical with expectations on when Afghanistan can return to a functioning democracy that's inclusive of all sides. But support for people's democratic aspirations should not be seen as something that's inconsistent or counterproductive to efforts to reach stability. Support for democratic values will send a clear message to the Taliban that they are not alone in Afghanistan, and that they can be part of the solution, but they can't be the solution. The majority of Afghanistan's population is aged between 30 and 40, who have a very real and deep belief in democracy. Let's also not forget that despite the very difficult and also controversial elections of the past, people took pride in having the chance to cast their vote to decide their future. So any eventual end state for peace should reflect Afghanistan's transformed society. Now, of course, the Taliban can and should be part of this arrangement in the spirit of unity, inclusivity, and stability. But if they choose not to join the national process, the people should not be left having to wait forever. My third point on regional support, the UN's role on regional support, I think we've seen in previous years before the military takeover that the UN worked closely with regional countries for their constructive support. Now, of course, these efforts didn't always produce the results that were needed, but they were useful in at least emphasizing cooperation on matters of security, peace and reconciliation, humanitarian assistance, and other issues. And it's obvious that without regional support for peace, the situation will not change. We know that if the Taliban had not been empowered from within the region and had known regional actors influence the Taliban to be serious about the political settlement in previous years, we would not be in this situation today. We can't change the past, but we can try and shape the future. So I think the UN should engage deeper with regional countries to reach a new regional consensus on peace in Afghanistan. And of course, this regional consensus must be part of a broader international consensus, which also needs UN support. The fourth point on human rights. The UN's activities have so far concerned monitoring and reporting of human rights violations, but less focus on measures to mitigate and prevent the violations. Yes, a special rapporteur on human rights, and Mr. Richard Bennett was appointed. He did recently visit Afghanistan, and I think his visit did help send a message to the Taliban that violations are being watched, they're being documented, and they're being reported. However, violations unfortunately continue against women and girls, but not just women and girls. We've seen the apprehension of former security officials, journalists, and women's activists, alongside extrajudicial killings. So I think it will be important for UNAMA to help strengthen the accountability component of international efforts in the area of human rights to bring perpetrators to justice. My fifth and final point, what the UN can and should do to build consensus in the Security Council. Now, it's obvious that any effort to restore order and stability in any conflict setting must first start with consensus among the permanent members of the Security Council. The United States, France, UK, China, and Russian Federation. So I think beyond the mandate of the UN, the organization, and specifically the Secretary General himself, can work with the 5 permanent members to reach some common ground that's needed to create a base for further activity. And we all know from the experience of 2001 what can be achieved when such consensus is there. Obviously, the holding of the Bonn Conference and the signing of and implementation of the agreement therein did set Afghanistan on a path of at least relative stability, if not absolute stability. Of course, reaching this common ground is never easy because of larger factors and dynamics, but this is the role and responsibility that the UN has. I'll end my comments there, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. Those are bold proposals, deliberately, explicitly bold proposals for the UN and for UNAMA in particular to be more assertive. And that raises the, I think, interesting question of constraints, how UNAMA views its constraints in relation to both its position in the country and also in terms of UN Security Council dynamics. And no doubt during the discussion, we'll have an opportunity to talk about the constraints. But I now turn to Ambassador Heimerbach. You're welcome. Fabulous to have you with us. And you're welcome to address our broad questions as you see fit. And we would encourage you to pay particular attention to the question of protection of human rights and women's rights. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Kroc Institute and PRIO for inviting us as a former penholder to this very important seminar today. I would start by saying that Norway, when we took on the job as penholder, we bring with us what has been a standing, Norwegian approach to the work in Afghanistan for a long time, and we haven't changed before or inside or coming out of the Security Council. We are principled but engaged. That's how we approach it, even when it's getting harder. And our policy is always based on international law, including international human rights law and the humanitarian principles. But we do engage because we always believe it's important to keep the dialogue open. And I think that's also a good way to come into this very difficult context that we had in the Security Council on the 17th of March last year, just 3 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. And certainly the dynamics of the Security Council has not improved over the past year. We see a more polarized Security Council. And I think we saw it as our main job when we started the negotiations of this very important but very difficult job of the UNAMA mandate, that we would make sure that even though we see the Security Council getting more polarized, we see definite national interest from major powers, China, Russia, and the US in Afghanistan. And we also had India as an elected member, complicated things. But we said that we will make sure for the Afghan people, for the women and girls of Afghanistan, that we will not see the Security Council get paralyzed on this issue. So we worked really hard paying attention to the superpowers' interest to see where we could find consensus, because the second goal for us was really to make sure that the Council could speak with one voice on this important issue on the future of Afghanistan and the presence of the United Nations in Afghanistan. So we were pleased, I will say, that we were able to adopt Resolution 2626. It is a robust mandate covering all the pillars. Amazingly enough, I would say at the time, it was not obvious that we would get there. And of course, specifically on human rights, given the extremely challenging conditions, we have a lot already in the mandate. And I hear now voices both online and also here in New York. There is a big discussion, you know, on potentially a rollover of what we have. Or should we go more realistic and look for, you know, the common, a lower kind of consensus with regards to ambitions for Afghanistan? And I think we would really, I should be careful with my words because there is a new penholder, but we would like to see the current members of the Council really trying to look into what we have, because the problem is really not that you need more or less. The problem right now is the implementation and how the UN is set up to reach what is possible and what is possible to for certain chapters of the mandate to increase the pressure on the de facto authorities. I think it's important, as in every issue on the Council right now, to stick together, to see that the Council could put aside and kind of compartmentalize the issues that divides the members and really look for a common denominator that we could push forward for the people in Afghanistan, and particularly for women and girls. And as we've said so many times, moving on to what I was specifically asked to address, we know that excluding women and girls will have or is having devastating effects both on human rights records, but also for the economy and potentially the security and stability in Afghanistan. Afghanistan depends on women's participation. The future of Afghanistan, the growth of an economy depends on participation of women. And this message is the important one to give to the Taliban, both in Kandahar and in Kabul. We know that the UN estimates that the economic losses on Afghanistan's GDP due to the erosion of women's employment, for example, are up to $1 billion. We know that excluding girls and older teenagers, and now also women from universities, will take away the future for these girls and women, also increasing child marriages and increasing domestic violence, as these women and girls basically are in house arrests. So for Norway, we still believe that UN must be a strong part of the future of Afghanistan, and that the mandate that we have in Resolution 2626, making sure that we address the problems of implementation, will actually take us forward, and a technical rollover, for example, for the Security Council will put us in a good place as we move forward. And engagement is difficult, and at the moment it hasn't taken us a lot forward. But I also believe that the latest trips by the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, also by Martin Griffiths, head of humanitarian work in the UN, will continue to put pressure, because it will, for example, not be possible for the UN to deliver on the humanitarian mandate in UNAMA if we don't engage the female humanitarian workers, both in UN but also in NGOs. Also, I would say I very much agree with my colleague on the panel that having a robust mandate, continuing to have a robust mandate, is very important for the accountability discussion that we need to have with the de facto authorities. The only way we can put pressure on them is, as I said, is to continue to engage. So we need the political part of the mandate. But we need also strong benchmarks on how we evaluate the cooperation with them, to be very clear. And I really think that it helps, as we did last year, for the Security Council to continue to speak with one voice. We've also been able to negotiate many statements over the past years to really strengthen what we have in the mandate and show that unity. And I really hope that the current Security Council will be able to take that forward, because we cannot leave anyone behind. Do we, start to pull away issues from the current mandate that could really erode kind of the whole package? And I believe that it's important to stand by what we have and really defend it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. We know from experience that mandates, UN Security Council mandates and other mandates are not self-implementing. You highlight the really critical issue of capacity to implement, and that capacity to implement is in part financial, it's in part technical expertise, but at the end of the day, ultimately, that implementation capacity is political. And in that regard, unity within the UN Security Council on Afghanistan and a renewed mandate is absolutely critical. So thank you for highlighting that. I turn now to Michael Keating. Michael, I understand you've recently been in Kabul, so you're welcome to share reflections on that. And on the question of engagement with Taliban, when Taliban took over, there was this initial question, do we or do we not engage Taliban? That's question has long been superseded by events. There is engagement. So you're welcome to share your reflections on potential and limitations in that regard. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Laurie. And I haven't that recently been in Kabul. It was about eight or 9 months ago now. But a couple of colleagues, I have a colleague there at the moment, and another one just came back. I mean, I think so much ground has been covered already. I think I would say that I guess my headlines would be that, others have covered the mandate and come up with some very sensible ideas, particularly Ambassador Heimerbach making those points. But I would say my headlines are that the UN does need to continue and broaden its engagement within the country, point number one. Point number two, make the case for keeping Afghanistan on the radar screen. And point number 3, encourage greater international coherence in grappling with the many dilemmas. Now, these may not be strictly spelled out in the mandate, but having been an SRSG and indeed in Afghanistan, a deputy SRSG, I think the UN can be creative in ways that are consistent with the mandate to do things in these areas. Obviously, as previous speakers have alluded to, we're operating in a very, very difficult international environment. I've just come back from the Munich Security Conference, and in fact, Hosna was part of a discussion we had there. There were a couple of discussions, and I was very pleased to get it onto the agenda there. But it's not automatic anymore. 2 years ago, Afghanistan was the biggest issue, biggest NATO operation in the world. Everybody was talking about it. Top diplomats being sent to Kabul, top journalists in Kabul, no foreign affairs minister, worth his or her salt, wasn't kind of well versed in Afghanistan. Right now, there aren't that many who are, plugged in and understanding the history. So this is a real issue. And to your point, Nathan, that ultimately the implementation capacity is political. Well, if the political constituency for engaging Afghanistan is eroding or being marginalized, then we have a problem. So I guess my point would be that while we're focusing on the minutiae of what UNAMA's mandate is, the whole point of the UN is to keep the place on the agenda, keep talking to everyone, and try and bring international actors together in a way that results in a coherent approach. Now, I guess another point I would make, which is perhaps very obvious, but nevertheless is worth making, maybe not to the group that's listening to this conversation, but everything is linked. There's a lot of focus on the humanitarian crisis, but obviously the humanitarian crisis cannot be resolved with humanitarian aid. So while you've got to make the case for humanitarian aid, you've got to recognize that if an acute crisis isn't going to turn into a chronic one, you've got to get the economy going. Well, to get the economy going, you've got to be able to attract investment. Well, to attract investment, whether it's private sector or public sector, a number of things that need to be in place, both of a practical and a regulatory, perhaps political nature, if that is going to work. So we should not kid ourselves that engaging with Afghanistan can be left at the level of humanitarian or indeed human rights. I think there's probably more engagement among international actors on the security side of things than there is on anything else. I think intelligence chiefs, security actors are able to connect with each other in ways that are often more difficult for politicians. And I think this is a very important point. The political bandwidth in many countries, perhaps more in the West and in the US, to engage in Afghanistan is extremely limited. You are not going to win many brownie points by going out there and advocating for more engagement with Afghanistan. And I have to pay my respects to the foreign minister of Norway, who is an exception, and I think very brave in this regard. There is a bit more appetite in the region to do so. So clearly one of the challenges, how respecting the various political red lines of actors in the region and the international actors, and given that perhaps there's a common understanding of the linkage between the humanitarian, the human rights, the political, the security, and the economic, who can play which roles? And what is the best way to bring people together in a manner that perhaps at least clarifies the red lines, the dilemmas, and so on. And I want to acknowledge, the conversations that take place. There are some in Kabul, there are some in Doha, there are some in Brussels. But actually, Hosna is my witness. When I was chairing this meeting at the Munich Security Conference, and I had 3 foreign ministers in front of me, I said, do you guys talk to each other about how you're working together to address Afghanistan? And they all looked at each other and said, no, we should do so, shouldn't we? Yes, you should. But I have some sympathy for them because there's Ukraine and there's all sorts of other issues. But again, going back to your point, Laurie, if ultimately it is, implementation capacity is political, one of the things that the UN does need to do is support those who are trying to keep Afghanistan high on the agenda beyond the purely security and so on. I guess, and the issue is, what are the political arguments to make for doing this? And ultimately, I do think that the objectives of the international community, whether they are to prevent Afghanistan from becoming an exporter of insecurity, whether they are to protect and promote human rights, including women's rights, whether they're to provide jobs and so on, are they more likely to be met through some form of principled, if conditional, engagement, or are they more likely to be met by having a somewhat chaotic, approach that often results in finger wagging at the Taliban, rather than trying to figure out practical ways in which you're going to get the economy done, in which you're going to maintain the capacity of the administration, and so on and so on. So I guess, my argument would be that going forward, and as I say, I do love the UN in Afghanistan. I first worked for it there in 1988, and I've worked for it 3 times there since. It's got an amazing network of national officers. It's got offices around the country. It is in a position to listen to people. It's in a position to engage with civil society. It's in a position to interpret the international community to local actors and to the Taliban, to interpret the Taliban to the international community. It's in a position to buttress the political case for remaining engaged with Afghanistan. It's in a position to strengthen the regional and Western conversation about who can do what to prevent the situation from deteriorating further, and perhaps even find ways in which to reboot the economy and to promote more inclusive governance in ways that make sense to the Taliban, and to incentivize conversations that perhaps strengthen the hand of those Taliban who are more pragmatic and more open-minded. I have to say, we also need to be aware of our limitations. Understanding tribal politics is not easy. It's very, very difficult for foreigners. And that's why the UN is also extraordinarily well equipped through its national network to help all of us understand that. So, I guess I would end where I started by saying that in addition to I'm not downplaying the importance of getting the mandate right and getting the language right. It's extremely important. But let's not that focus allow us to forget the bigger picture here, which is the deprioritization of Afghanistan, the lack of coherence in terms of the international approach to it. I think there is, the Security Council is always talking about conflict prevention. We are in a slow conflict prevention mode now. We really are, I think, if the security situation continues to deteriorate, the economic situation. So, what can the UN serve as a platform for bringing a much larger group of actors, both Afghan inside the country, outside the country, together, as well as governments, to try and craft a more coherent international approach, given that, ironically, the confluence of interest among international actors on Afghanistan is actually very strong. Everybody wants the place to stabilize. No one wants it to be an exporter of drugs or people or illicit economic activity. So I guess that would be my appeal. Thanks, Laurie.
Michael, thank you. I want to highlight a key point that you're making. We know from our personal experience, and this is confirmed by research, that the extent to which the international community has a harmonized, coordinated position on a conflict area, to that extent, it is effective. And the less coordinated, the less harmonized, the less effective it tends to be. In a situation like this, the UN is not the coordinator and harmonizer of last resort, it's the coordinator and harmonizer of first resort. It is the only institution that really has the authority and the mandate to attempt to harmonize the international response and to ensure that this issue remains on the agenda as you push so strongly. Ms. Jalil, I turn to you. you've heard the debate. You're welcome to comment as you see fit. I would encourage you to look, especially at the question of humanitarian aid. Some of our previous speakers have made the point that it's one thing for the UN to attend to the symptoms of the humanitarian problem, but there's also the bigger political question of the extent to which it can address the sources of the humanitarian crisis. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. And it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion with all the distinguished panelists. I mean, from my perspective, if the UN would focus only on the response of the humanitarian crisis when it comes to the prioritization, Afghanistan would become a never-ending humanitarian crisis. And Afghanistan, and I mean, all the resources and all the elements and the stakeholders, the national level stakeholders should be part of the actors to resolve the humanitarian crisis. So from my perspective, what the UN is doing in Afghanistan right now is stepping in as an actor with limited resources. I mean, when I'm saying as an actor, I mean, they themselves are trying to resolve it. But there are so many other actors and stakeholders that the UN can coordinate among them, that the UN can bring all of them on the same page and can help them to work on their prioritization. So one thing that I do feel that UN needs to focus more on when it comes to the human rights violation. I mean, this is one of the examples why I'm saying that the UN should upgrade the level of engagement it has in Afghanistan and engage the resources which is already there. The UN is having field officers to document humanitarian Taliban's either atrocities or human rights violations. There are multiple civil society at the very local level, civil society organizations or groups, even if they're not registered. There are activists, there are citizens at the citizen level, citizens who wants to volunteer in documenting those atrocities. All they need is a training. That's what they lack. What I would propose for the UN is to use those field officers or deploy those field officers as trainers for these stakeholders. And that's how we can expand the scope of activities, but at the same time, we can cover more. The other aspect of it is that the international NGOs in Afghanistan, when it comes to either provision of service, access to basic services, or responding to the crisis, there are multiple international actors in Afghanistan that they do need direction. They do need, I echo what Michael just mentioned, they do need coordination among themselves. They don't speak properly to each other. They're not coordinated at all. And that is, the lack of coordination I consider is a weakness that the international community is presenting in front of the Taliban. But if there would be a very strong coordination, that would become a strength and a pressure point on the Taliban. At this point in time, I think the coordination is not emphasized much. The reason is because the base assumption is that the Taliban doesn't care about the humanitarian aid. And if we pressurize the Taliban through humanitarian aid, the Afghans would suffer. I would push back that argument, that base assumption. The reason is because no matter how arrogantly the Taliban might show up and says that, well, God is going to feed the Afghans or the people, we are Muslims. No matter what they are saying on the screen or to the media, if we look at how a cleric is pleading for the humanitarian aid in a mosque across the country and in the very local area, that itself says a lot about Taliban being disparate about the humanitarian aid. So I think we need to change our source of information on how the Taliban value the humanitarian aid. So a couple of positions that the UN needs to push when it comes to the coordination among the international organizations. One, when it comes to women employment in the humanitarian aid, I don't think that's something that any international NGO can compromise or should compromise. The reason is because they need to be part of the aid delivery, otherwise they're not going to be considered aid beneficiary. And women also have been in the last 20 years a good representative in the aid distribution for marginalized groups, for vulnerable groups, and for children. And these categories are the primary victims of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan right now. So that is one thing that I've seen a couple of NGOs being allowed verbally based on a bilateral negotiation between the Taliban and the NGOs, allowed to have their female employees. And if the Taliban have that flexibility, and they did have quite similar experience in 1990s, I do believe that can be a great base for UNAMA to step in, to coordinate among the international NGOs and to present a very strong stance when it comes to the women's employment in Afghanistan in the international NGOs. I know that Save the Children is being allowed to verbally to have their female employees, IRC is being allowed to have their employees, CARE is allowed to have their employees. But then at the same time, you see how the Taliban are discriminating between the international NGOs. That can be avoided by very strong coordination among themselves. And UNAMA can lead that. For example, the French origin MSF, the Doctors Without Border, that is one of the organizations that even in 1990s have been discriminated or poorly treated in 1990s. That's what I can say. So that is something, I mean, end of the day, the goal that why the international communities, the international NGOs are on the ground in Afghanistan is to help Afghans. And they are coming from a very diversified scope of work to make sure that they cover all the aspects of the need that the Afghans have in terms of the basic services or in terms of the humanitarian assistance. The last point that I would like to mention here is about the prioritization of what the Afghans need at this point in time. Even in the humanitarian assistance, I do understand that there are a couple of areas that is being deprioritized, and one of them is Afghans' access to justice. I understand that particularly women's access to justice. At this point in time, I understand that the state judicial system itself is being unjust to women in Afghanistan. But there are multiple stakeholders in Afghanistan, non-governmental stakeholders, that can be a good source of provision of judicial services to women, or at least legal services to women, that UNAMA, through the international NGOs, can support them and can prioritize. At this point in time, women's access to food and in general, population's access to food security. And then after that, of course, education and health is being prioritized, but justice big time is being deprioritized and no one talks about it. And I do think that is something that Afghans needed as much as they need education and food. So I would end it there and I would look forward to questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Jalil. This discussion highlights a tension that we might want to talk about now. I invite all the panelists to put the cameras on. There's a tension between at least three different imperatives. There's the imperative of engaging the Taliban, which is governing, the de facto governing authority for the purpose of delivery of humanitarian aid and for other purposes. There is second, the imperative of pressure from the UN and the international community with respect to atrocities and human rights abuses and harassment and discrimination against women and girls. And thirdly, there's the imperative of facilitating dialogue, which presupposes that all the conflict parties have some trust, some confidence in the facilitator and don't perceive the facilitator to be hopelessly biased against them. So these are always tensions, and they come with the role of the UN in high-intensity conflict. So they're not specific to Afghanistan, but Afghanistan poses particular challenges in this regard. I invite the panelists to comment on that or to comment on anything that any other panelist has said. So you're welcome to agree, to amplify, you're welcome to disagree with each other in the interests of a productive and constructive debate. If you want to talk, you can either use the hand function on Zoom or just raise your hand and I will call on you in the order in which you appear. Yeah, Ambassador Gafosa.
Well, thank you very much again. Thank all colleagues for the very useful insights. I think the issue of lack of coordination and really not a sense of readiness in the international environment to start something serious for Afghanistan. We understand the dynamics in the Council and elsewhere. But I think despite the differences of views, one thing is clear, that there is a strong international recognition on the need for political stability and inclusive governance. Now, this issue has been emphasized by regional countries, countries in the immediate region, more distant region, regional organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the CSTO, partner countries in the West, the US, European countries, Western organizations such as NATO members, EU. So there is international consensus on the need for inclusive governance. The gap so far has been the lack of a mechanism or pathway to move such a process forward. For that reason, one thing that has not been considered so far, and hopefully it will be considered during the course of the coming months, is the development of a political roadmap. A political roadmap with specific benchmarks on what has to be achieved in a phase-by-phase process, both in terms of engagement with non-Taliban figures, engagement with the Taliban. And I also want to emphasize, when we talk about engagement with non-Taliban figures, the younger generation, civil society, who have developed, who have emerged, who are very ready to do something, make a serious contribution for the future of the country, they have to really be considered. And of course, a political roadmap and a discussion that takes into account of the dynamics of Afghan society. We have traditional figures, traditional forces, the younger generation. So such a political roadmap will be very important. I think, again, coming back to my previous point, the recognition is there, but a roadmap needs to be developed.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Heimbach. You're welcome to say whatever you want to, but I would also be interested in your thoughts on the question of a coordinating mechanism. We have many precedents from Afghanistan and indeed, but also from other conflicts where there is some kind of coordinating mechanism among the key external actors, whether at regional and or at the global level. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. What's the potential? What's the limitation? What's in fact happening right now? And what you think needs to be done in addition to any other issues you wish to address. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to address the engagement question a little bit first, since Norway has been kind of in front on the engagement line of work. And we are not naive. We know what we did when we invited the Taliban to Oslo last January, before we were going to negotiate the mandate. I think we always believe in engagement, and we certainly know that the Taliban knows that engagement is not recognition. It's very clear. They know it. There is no misunderstanding in that. Recognition is something very different. But we give them an opportunity to listen to what we have to say, to the conditions we have for any possible recognition that may come in the future, is to build an inclusive government with respect for international law and international norms and values, including for women and girls. And this engagement always includes the participation of women and girls, and it's an attempt to facilitate any dialogue that may take place also between the groups inside Afghanistan. And if we don't have the opportunity to tell them what we expect, it's harder to argue for accountability later. So at least they have to listen, and we will listen to them. But they also know, as long as they don't have the inclusiveness, as long as they continue with the human rights violations that they do, there is no, long-term financing coming. There are no Western parliaments that will finance the current authorities in that way. And that also is coming back to what Mr. Keating said about financing.
humanitarian financing is under enormous pressure. It's never been worse. It's overstretched completely, and I think that could be a challenge also for implementation of the mandate and any other UN work in Afghanistan as we move forward. I also addressed the importance of implementation, and it also comes down to how the UN is financing their own political missions. And I would very much encourage, and we've done that during our time on the council, when countries negotiate a mandate in the Security Council, it's a binding resolution for all members. They also have to pay attention to what happens in the Fifth Committee, where we finance that mandate and then all aspects of the resolution. And I can see that financing is also under pressure currently. On the coordination mechanism, we support it and think this would be a constructive way forward. We're currently here in New York discussing it at a special representative format. But it's also, everybody's coming from a little different angle. We have our different priorities, but I think it's a good way to move forward now, also in order to address what also Mr. Keating said about, the world focusing very much not only on Ukraine, but the consequences of Ukraine. And we certainly need, to step up the work in Afghanistan, and a mechanism could support that. And I would, of course, with my background, very much hope that this mechanism would have implementation of the mandate as its focus. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I'm invite the other panelists to come into the conversation as and when they like. I'm interested in how you, the panelists, view the question of Taliban needs and Taliban interests that could be exploited to advance the UN mandate and UN norms. So instead of just looking at the Taliban as the object of pressure, there's also the question of what do they want, what do they need from the UN and the international system that could legitimately and appropriately be provided as a form of constructive engagement. Is that a realistic way of framing it, or do you think this is politically naive? Ms. Jalil, I'm going to invite you in on this question. Take whatever view you want.
Well, it might be a little bit controversial, but I feel like I need to express myself here. When it comes to how the UNAMA's presence in Afghanistan can be exploited, I think we did have a few examples when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. We had reached to a point where UNAMA was trying to convince Afghans who have been speaking against the Taliban. UNAMA was trying to convince them that the Taliban have changed, and not only that they have not changed, any Afghan expressing themselves in international platforms, UNAMA would have considered them or treated them as spoilers of the stability in Afghanistan and anti-engagement with the Taliban. I don't blame UNAMA, but I do think that UNAMA needed to take more time actually to take a stance like that. And I don't think that this is only my perspective, but I do know a handful of Afghans who have been actively raising their voices against the Taliban's policies and the Taliban's governance or regime. We had lived that regime, Nathan. The reason that we have been, not that we are against engagement with the Taliban, we are all pro-engagement, and we have been pro-engagement with the Taliban for the last 20 years. And we did feel that the end of the war would be the end of the war would happen only if we engage with the Taliban and listen to them, and we at least understand what is going on their side. So, I mean, the reason that I can say that it was exploited by the Taliban was that the Taliban used the engagement with the UN to spread more disinformation and deceive them. I don't say that UNAMA was naive, but I would definitely say that they rushed to conclusion too quick. And when it comes to how much, how the Taliban perceives UNAMA's role as important, the Taliban does understand. I mean, the Taliban being bad guys, they're not stupid. That's one thing that we need to understand. Being bad guy does not mean that they don't know anything. They do have their calculation and they're smart enough to understand UNAMA's rule is important for them and is important for Afghanistan. There's one thing that I would like to highlight here is that the Kabul-based Taliban, being in their 30s and 40s, young, politically ambitious, they are sticking their future political career in the survival of the regime. And they do know that UNAMA and the engagement that UNAMA can offer them in terms of their engagement with the international stakeholders, that itself is part of securing the survival of their regime. So the Kabul-based younger Taliban's leadership, they are the ones who would put more importance on UNAMA's, I would say, mandate in Afghanistan, rather than the Kandahar-based older senior leaders of the Taliban. So I don't say that they are more powerful than the Kandahar-based, but they are, I would say, a big element of the Taliban, who understands UNAMA's mandate and who gives importance to it and importance to the mandate, particularly when it comes to UNAMA being an engagement platform for the Taliban and the outside world.
That's very helpful. It highlights the fact that Taliban, like all political movements and all political parties, is not homogenous. There's no political movement anywhere in the world, including Taliban, that is a homogenous actor. It comprises factions and leadership of different generations with different perspectives. I've noted Professor Harp-Eichen, but Michael Keating has indicated through the chat function on Zoom that he has an urgent matter to attend to and will be leaving us shortly. So I'm going to bring in Mr. Keating, and then I'll come to you, Christian.
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. I have to go off. But just in response to a couple of your questions, Laurie, I mean, you said, what is it that the Taliban need and want, expect? And then you added from the UN mandate. I can answer the first part of that with a view to contributing to the second part. I mean, and again, there are many on this call who may have a better grip on this than me, but in my conversations in Kabul, I believe this is the experience of my colleagues talking to them. I mean, first of all, they want respect. And they don't feel they get it. I mean, they feel they have just won a 20-year conflict against forces that are massively more significant than them, and they've won it. Secondly, they would like legal recognition, as you know. I mean, none of this is new stuff. Thirdly, many of the conversations I've had very quickly get to the issue of capacity, technical assistance, knowledge on how to actually do things, how to get things done. And then fourthly, money, whether it's private sector investment, whether it's aid. But the last thing I found, and this is where you've got to be, I suppose, slightly careful, but the other thing they're in the market for is advice. You know, and as you say, it depends on which Taliban you're talking to. But the dynamic that I experienced over and over again is you would meet a minister, a Talib official, who would have a bunch of technocrats in front of him, and he would be wanting to show that he's got a grip on the technical issues, but was also interested in advice on how to go about fulfilling his job. That's not the case for all of them, but a number of them are clearly in the business of seeking advice. Now, there are, of course, issues around this. I mean, the degree to which one should be forward-leaning about providing advice on certain things. But I would imagine there are areas in which advice is not terribly controversial and is consistent with the objective of relieving humanitarian need and rebooting the economy and all the rest of it. So the question is, what is it that the UN is and is not capable itself and mandated to do, and to be, through the agency's funds and programs, or indeed through UNAMA itself. In terms of your question about facilitating dialogue, well, of course, it does depend on what dialogue you're talking about. And I can think of at least four different forms of dialogue. I mean, there's the dialogue within the international community, and one would have thought the UN is well placed to do that. There's the dialogue between the Taliban and the international community, and again, I would hope that the UN is well placed to do that. There's Taliban, rest of Afghans dialogue, and there I think the UN can play an important role, but maybe there are other actors in partnership with the UN who can do that. And then there's dialogue, bizarrely, within the Taliban movement. I do not think this is necessarily a role that the UN can play, but it can certainly encourage it. I do think that the dialogue between Taliban and Afghan civil society, I think there's much greater scope there than has been the case, including in the diaspora. One of the problems, maybe this has died down, but every time I had a conversation with them about inclusive approaches, they would automatically assume you're talking about bringing back warlords or, bringing back former political leaders. And, I was making the point that actually dialogue, you could bring people in from all the districts and have a conversation over a week about your priorities. I mean, dialogue doesn't have to be some kind of high-level political negotiation. You can show that you're willing to listen and to impart, but and maybe I'm being naive here. I think Afghans are the world's best talkers. They're very good at talking to each other. They know how to do it. So the idea that they need external advice on doing this, on the other hand, maybe some experience from other parts of the world about how you can do this and how you can structure it would be useful. And I think the UN, I know it's difficult for the UN. There are all these security constraints. There are funding issues and so on. But supporting the UN, either to play a direct role in some of these things or encouraging them to partner with others or encourage others to play this role, it seems to me to be very important. It's not about UN doing everything itself. May I just profoundly apologize that I have to go. I'm so sorry. I would love to stay for the rest of this, but I have a group of anxious colleagues who need me to address something very urgent. So thank you so much.
Michael, appreciate that. Thank you. So I think some really fascinating points here about the different kinds of dialogue with different actors and different purposes, rather than simply viewing dialogue as one thing or as a single process. That's very helpful. So Professor Halfwijken, I hand over to you, and then Arif, if you want to come in, I'll give you an opportunity. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Very, very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and there's a lot to ponder about, and meet here for quite a few other roundtables on a number of more specific issues. But let me here stick to the main issue at hand, the UNAMA mandate, and I just want to pose a couple of questions, 3 questions to be exact, to the other panelists to see if any of those would pick up your interest. I have the privilege of offering some concluding remarks at the end, so I won't be providing much analysis here. But my first question is, and this really piggybacks on a webinar I was attending yesterday on virtually the same topic, hosted by the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, where at least one of the panelists proposed that time was now ripe for scrapping UNAMA altogether. The only thing that UNAMA was capable of doing in this situation was providing humanitarian aid, and that could be more effectively done without UNAMA than with it. That's a radical proposition, and I don't think it's one that is frequently aired in the corridors in New York, but it may be worth entertaining whether at least that's something you want to argue against. My second question is about time. And it really builds on what I think is inherent in the comments that many of you have provided, which is that it does not seem that a massive reform within the Taliban leadership is likely in the foreseeable future. Now, whether that means weeks, months, or years, none of us know. But when we talk about the UNAMA mandate and its renewal now for another year, it is a question what kind of time perspective it is that we place on this. We can be optimistic, and we should perhaps be somewhat optimistic with a realistic tilt. But nonetheless, it does not seem to me very realistic that we'll see massive reforms in the short term. Which brings me to the third question, and that is, how can we be principled and at the same time avoid painting ourselves into a corner where there is no alternative to cutting off ties? And I'm saying that in light of some of the very dramatic resolutions that has come out of Kandahar over the last couple of months. I mean, they're not all that surprising, but they are quite dramatic. And although there has been differences of opinion amongst aid providers and other international actors, by and large, there has been a willingness to stand up to Taliban demands in closing women out of aid provision and closing women and girls out of education. Now, the danger here is, of course, that if reforms at best are somewhere in the distant future and UNAMA's existence is potentially a pivotal resource to be able to pick up when and if openings are provided, how is it that we're able to maintain that presence without unacceptably compromising the values that the UN is founded on? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think your second point in particular, Christian, highlights a fundamental political challenge. We want to have some engagement with Taliban, but we're not convinced at this stage that they are susceptible or receptive to reform. And I think your third challenge is generalizable. In these kind of complex situations, we expect the UN to maintain a principled position and remain true to its own charter and declarations and norms. But on the other hand, it is a facilitator of dialogue and it's a mediator. And that requires a measure of impartiality that may sometimes be in tension with a human rights advocacy position. So Arif, you have the opportunity to deal with all these easy questions now.
Well, thank you. This is a fascinating conversation. I will just make a few very brief points. Number one is that I think we need to get out of a Taliban-centric approach when we deal with Afghanistan and take more of an Afghanistan-inclusive approach. And that requires a fifth, perhaps, dialogue route, which is between the international community and all other Afghan actors, which was left out earlier. The expertise and money and advice, all of those things that the Taliban need, Afghans themselves have. All of these people who were able to and are able to provide this expertise, who have received all the training and education, are being excluded. And so they shouldn't come to the international community to ask these things. We already have them, and that should be utilized. Three other points. One is, I think no matter how hard we try or how loud we speak, we cannot ignore that a political process of some sort is needed. We cannot resolve the problems of Afghanistan with technical discussions of how to solve a banking issue, of how to get humanitarian aid to a certain village. We have to address the source, we have to address the environment, and the environment is political. Unless we do that, I'm afraid we cannot get anywhere. Technical discussions can only buy us time, nothing else. Point number two is we have appealed to needs, we have appealed to religious values, we have appealed and provided support. Basically, the principle of reciprocity. We provide something to the Taliban and hopefully they will return the favor. This has not worked. And this takes me to my last point, is that if we want the Taliban to be inclusive, then we need to be inclusive. The international community needs to be inclusive. The international community cannot expect the Taliban to engage other Afghans if the international community is not willing to do so. And so I think that the discussion of engagement needs to broaden. The debate even among Afghans is not whether to engage the Taliban or not, but it's whether to and who to engage from Afghanistan. And so we need to broaden. Nobody is saying we shouldn't engage. But what we are saying is that we need to have an inclusive engagement with all Afghan actors inside and outside of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. Yes, so Ambassador Ghafoor, I see your hand. I just wanted to feed in, you're welcome to respond as you like, but just to feed in one of the questions that's come up from our audience through the Q&A function on Zoom that I have sight of, I don't think all the panelists have sight of, is who is best placed to facilitate the dialogue amongst Afghans in the diaspora? Is it in fact the UN? Or is this something that ought to be organized by Afghans themselves as opposed to relying on the UN? Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Before commenting on that issue, just a general point on what the role of UNAMA should be. There were some suggestions in yesterday's discussion about the UNAMA no longer having to exist because of the frustrations that exist. But I think it's quite clear that despite the constraints in a difficult situation, UNAMA's mandate is very important. It has to continue for political dialogue, for regional international consensus, for issue of human rights. But at the same time, I think there are certain things that can be considered in order to improve and ensure delivery over the course of the year. And then what comes to mind is in 2012 and 2017, the UN did conduct 2 strategic reviews of its activities, of its mandated activities, in order to ensure greater coherence and coordination. I think during the course of the year, a review of UNAMA's mandated activities in specific areas could be helpful. Could be helpful to assess what benchmarks, what progress was made in specific areas over the course of 6 to 8 months, and I think that's something that can be useful. The second point, what my colleague Arif Dosyar mentioned, definitely the continuation of the political process. I think there has to be a recognition that resolving the outstanding issues in Afghanistan requires a serious political process, and it won't be addressed through technical discussions on technical issues, all of which, of course, are extremely important. One roadmap was presented to the Taliban by a delegation of civil society in January of last year, when the Taliban delegation came here. Of course, there are questions regarding the visit, and we know that it wasn't an easy decision for the visit to take place by the host country. But at the end of the day, I think we have to acknowledge that a useful roadmap was presented to the Taliban by a delegation of civil society on specific measures that have to be done to lead Afghanistan towards stability. But unfortunately, since then, now we're almost 14 months since then, we haven't seen any degree of progress on any of the core issues that were contained in that roadmap. Regarding coordination with the diaspora, I think discussions are continuing. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, the people of Afghanistan, despite the very tragic and difficult situation, they're very active. And we see it here in Norway among the diaspora community. Our other colleagues see it in different capitals around the world. They're very closely coordinated. They're ambitious. They're courageous. They have ideas. And I think that activity will only increase from here on. In terms of a coordinating role, I think the UN, just as the responsibility is included in the mandate of the UN, engagement with stakeholders outside Afghanistan as well. I think that's one issue that the UN can also look at, how to engage with civil society as well as part of the overall engagement activity. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Heimerbach?
There you go. Thank you. No, just very shortly on Christian's challenge here, since maybe I'm here to defend the mandate. I would just warn very much against minimizing, scrapping, or even lowering the bar for the ambitions that the UN should have. Because what we've learned in the current climate and in the context that we diplomats try to maneuver is that you should never give up if you have something good, even if it's hard and if it's could be at the time a little bit unrealistic. You should keep it. You should keep your strategic patience. And I would then highlight another form of dialogue that we have put very much attention into during our term on the council, and that's between civil society and the Security Council. We really opened up all the meetings that we were having on Afghanistan for women briefers to the council, which was, showed up to be very important, both for the Security Council to hear, and so that all members cannot say that they haven't heard or that they doubt it, but also for the women themselves to have this platform, the most maybe important room in the world, that they were welcome in. They were given this platform, both diaspora and women coming from Afghanistan. I think that also contributed very much to the current mandate, and I really hope that we could see that space remain. Despite the very difficult circumstances between the permanent 5 members.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we're in the last round of comments before I hand over to Professor Harp-Eiken. Ms. Jalil, any final remarks from your side?
No further comment from my end.
Okay, thank you. From any of the other panelists then? Before I hand over to Christian, any final remarks?
I would like to I would like to just thank the Security Council. I think we need to acknowledge that they have been engaging the civil society, and really sincerely thank you for raising that issue.
Thank you. Ambassador Gafursa, you have the second last final word.
Thank you. Thank you again. Just my gratitude and appreciation for wonderful discussion, very useful, very timely. But just a final point, I think it's important 17 months on that with regard to the new international approach and focus, absolutely critical to place the people at the center of all efforts to stabilize Afghanistan. And we'll hope that from here on, we'll be entering a new phase in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian, you have the opportunity now. You have 1 or 2 more minutes than scheduled for your final remarks, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Laurie, and thank you to all panelists for fabulously insightful remarks. I've learned a lot from this discussion, and I'm not even sure where to start to pay justice to the richness of the commentaries that were provided. So I probably won't be able to do that, and for that I apologize in advance. But let me pick out a few things that caught my attention. And actually, in preparing for today's event, I was revisiting my notes from an event that we hosted exactly on the day 1 year ago on the same topic. And of course, that was the first renewal of the mandate after the Taliban's de facto takeover of power in August 2021. And a couple of things that we discussed then stood out. We had with us, for example, Scott Smith, who worked then and now at the UNAMA mission in Kabul. And he gave some insights into discussions that they were having with the Taliban. And one of the things that came out quite strongly in the discussion we had then was that they experienced at UNAMA Kabul quite a strong welcoming from the Taliban side of a comprehensive UN mandate, including strong formulations on human rights, not necessarily equally welcoming or strong formulations on inclusive governance, but nonetheless, I think that stands out. And of course, now 1 year later, we may want to ask whether that relative welcoming approach from the Taliban's side in Kabul was genuine, or whether it was I think as Husna Dalil formulated it, also because there would be meat in that which would provide an opportunity to manipulate and seek, if not recognition, at least some type of international exposure. So I think that's food for thought. But the other thing that really stood out for me, and this is obvious to everybody in the panel, but I think still it needs mentioning again, and that is that after 20 years in which the UN always played second fiddle, the UN now is not even the main show in town, but perhaps the only show in town. There's nobody else who now is interested in shouldering a responsibility for some sort of a concerted international approach to what happens in Afghanistan. And of course, that tells you also something about the fate of being the UN, that it's in this situation that you're invited to take full responsibility, but that may be for a different discussion. What I just said, of course, also speaks to Ambassador Ghafour Sai's very short expose of the history of the UN in Afghanistan from the onset of wars in the late 1970s to the present, something I think we could have spent much more time discussing, but which I do think is important, and perhaps of particular importance, and you touched upon this, Ambassador, is the experience that we have from engaging more or less successfully with the Taliban leadership when the Taliban were last in power from 1996 to 2001. We often say that the Taliban is very much the same as they were. I'm not convinced that that is true, but I am convinced that when it comes to how to engage, the costs of engagement, the modes of engagement, and what it is that we can realistically expect, there is a lot to learn from the experience of the latter part of the 1990s. I very much appreciate the Ambassador Heimerbach's forceful defense of maintaining what we have. I think that was well argued, and I do think it syncs very well with other panelists who may have been somewhat more critical of the current mandate, but nonetheless, I think there is quite a degree of consensus on this panel in shifting the attention away from discussing the details of the mandate, rather keep what we have, but focus on the implementation. And if anybody thinks that the way to get more energy into the implementation is to start tampering with the mandate, at least there has been quite forceful arguments against that made in this very panel. I also thought Michael Keating, who unfortunately had to leave us, had a number of interesting observations. And of course, he has been dealing with difficult regimes in Afghanistan in the past, so he can draw on that. He's not alone on the panel in having that experience, of course. But I think in his whole approach, there is also a very sincere call for realism. It's not impossible to have a dialogue, but it is very unrealistic to see a radical transformation of the Taliban, at least in the short term. And then the last issue I want to pick up on, and this is one that I really hope that we could find the time and the occasion to return to, is the call that cut through many of the interventions for an engagement, a dialogue which brings in not only those who keep residing in Afghanistan, but all those who do not find it possible to live in Afghanistan at the moment, whether they left during the prior rounds of war or they left in August 2021 or even after. There is no doubt that a lot of Afghanistan's human capacity, political competence, dare I even say political imagination, now resides in the diaspora, and those are resources that we will need to engage and able to move forward. Now, is that UNAMA's role? I certainly don't think UNAMA can neglect that fact. There may be others who should spearhead such an effort, but the larger discussion about what the interaction should be between those who are residing in the diaspora and those who continue to reside in the country, and perhaps even also interlocutors within the current de facto authorities, the Taliban, I think is something that merits a lot more reflection than we had the space for in this particular seminar. But I was intrigued by the fact that so many of you identified that as a key issue in terms of implementation challenges as we move forward, that I wanted to pick it out and give it a little extra attention here towards the end. Then again, apologies for everything I didn't reflect properly in my comments. It was a super rich and very insightful discussion. Thanks again to all panelists. Thanks to Notre Dame for co-hosting this with us, for taking the initiative and inviting us on board, I should say. We're very grateful for that. And we'll certainly keep our eyes fixed on UNAMA's role also as we look forward. Thanks again.
Christian, thank you very much for the closing remarks. Well done. I have been keeping through this discussion a list of possible follow-up issues, questions, and actions. It's a fairly long list. And from our side, we will be thinking further with Priya, our partner, but we hope also with the other panelists. We are at your disposal to cooperate, collaborate, especially on facilitation of dialogue, which is one of our specialities at the Kroc Institute. I want to express my appreciation to Arif for organizing this event, to my other Kroc colleagues who have been absolutely fantastic in sorting out the logistics and the publicity. I want to express my appreciation to all the panelists. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your insights and positive contributions. And then finally, to express solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. Here at Kroc Institute in South Bend, Indiana, we're at far remove. And it's important to remind ourselves at all times that we're dealing with large numbers of human beings that are in a really difficult place, and many of them suffering gravely. So we close by expressing our solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. Thank you all very much for your participation.